The cops showed up before I even got the jet ski back on the dock. 1 minute I was skimming across the lake behind my house, soaking up the last bit of sunlight, and the next, I had 2 squad cars pulling up by the HOA clubhouse across the water, lights flashing like I'd robbed a bank. I killed the engine, confused as hell, and eased the jet ski up to my dock. Officer Ramirez met me halfway, stepping over my wife's flower bed like it was a crime scene. "Sir, we got a call about unauthorized motorized watercraft use on community property." I blinked. Community property. "That's my lake." From across the shoreline, I heard the shrill voice of the HOA president, Gloria Kingsley, echoing like a siren. She stood in her usual pastel cardigan and white caprice, flanked by her loyal minions from the HOA board women who all looked like they'd walked out of the same retirement brochure. "That lake is under HOA jurisdiction," she barked. "It's a safety hazard. No motorized vehicles allowed." I stepped off the dock, still dripping, and grabbed the waterproof folder I kept in my outdoor storage bin. I'd been expecting something like this ever since Gloria started leaving passive-aggressive notes in my mailbox about unauthorized aquatic activity. What she didn't know, I'd done my homework. "Officer, I've got the original property deed right here," I said, flipping it open to a highlighted section. "The lake behind my home is private and under my sole ownership. It was carved out back in the 70s when the land was first parceled. It's not part of the HOA's common areas." Ramirez took the folder and read the line I'd marked in neon yellow. "Parcel 17B retains full ownership and rights to the adjacent watershed as outlined in Appendix C." He looked up at me, then at Gloria. "Ma'am, unless you have a legal document that overrides this deed, I think we're done here." Gloria's face flushed the exact shade of canned cranberry sauce. "That can't be right," she stammered. "We have bylaws, and bylaws don't override a legal deed," I said, crossing my arms. "You might want to check your own documents before you call the cops on a homeowner doing laps on his own lake." Ramirez handed the folder back to me and nodded. "Have a good evening, sir." As the squad cars backed out, Gloria stormed off, muttering something about calling the board. I figured that'd be the end of it. I underestimated how petty Gloria Kingsley could be, and how determined she was to bury me in fines, threats, and one very illegal stunt that would come back to bite her hard. 3 days passed before the next shot was fired. I was in my garage, replacing the spark plugs on the jet ski, when a white SUV with the HOA logo on the side rolled up like it owned the road. It came to a stop 2 feet from my mailbox, and out stepped Ken Mallory, Gloria's husband, and the HOA's so-called grounds compliance officer. He wore pleated khakis, a navy polo, and the kind of sunglasses that made him look like he'd just retired from mall security. He didn't say a word, just pulled out a phone and started snapping pictures of my trash bins. I leaned against the workbench and waited. When he got to photographing the grass between the cracks in my driveway, I finally spoke. "You waiting for it to bloom into a tree, Ken?" He didn't answer. Just kept taking photos like some deranged botanist. After a few more seconds, he pointed at the gutter along my roofline. "That downspout doesn't meet HOA water runoff codes. I'm writing it up." I raised an eyebrow. "It hasn't rained in weeks." "Still non-compliant," he muttered. That's when I noticed the tablet in his hand. He was logging violations in real time. Not just my house, every address around the cul-de-sac had a digital profile, complete with photos, notes, and running tallies. He wasn't just harassing me, he was building a file. "You all starting a blacklist or something?" I asked, stepping closer. He clicked something on the screen without looking up. "We're just enforcing standards." By sunset, a printed notice had been duct taped to my front door, not mailed, not placed inside a weatherproof envelope. Just slapped across the glass like a foreclosure sign. "Notice of violation," it read in bold red font. "Failure to comply with HOA environmental and structural guidelines. Fines to be assessed weekly." It was signed by Gloria. No surprise. The next morning, I visited the county records office. I'd already dug into the deed, but now it was time to pull every document tied to the HOA's incorporation, land use, and enforcement authority. 2 hours later, I had a stack of photocopies and a thumb drive full of digital records. Gloria's HOA had filed an amendment to their charter 6 months ago, an amendment that attempted to reclassify several properties, including mine, as Class B community parcels. That term wasn't just bureaucratic fluff. It was a legal maneuver designed to fold independent lots into HOA jurisdiction without homeowner consent. But the trick was, for that to stick, they needed signatures from 75% of the affected lot owners. They had 11 out of 42, and yet they'd filed it anyway. I drove straight to the county clerk's office and requested a fraud inquiry. The clerk, a no-nonsense woman named Jeline with half-moon glasses and a sharp memory, raised an eyebrow when I laid out the documents. "They submitted this under penalty of perjury," she said. "And you're saying they never got the votes?" "They didn't even ask most of us," I replied. "They forged the numbers." She shook her head slowly. "That's not just a civil issue. That's criminal misrepresentation." She excused herself, disappeared into a back office, and returned 5 minutes later with an investigator from the county compliance unit. I handed over the files, including copies of the amendment and a notarized statement from my neighbor, Greg, who confirmed his signature had been forged. By the time I got home, a black sedan with county plates was parked outside the HOA clubhouse. That evening, Gloria held an emergency board meeting. She didn't invite homeowners, but she forgot that the clubhouse's back door facing the lake had a loose latch. I watched the whole thing from a lawn chair, sipping lemonade and recording every word through the cracked door. "We'll say it was a clerical error," Gloria said, flipping through a binder. "We'll say the signatures were misfiled," Ken piped up. "They're already investigating, we need a fallback." "Maybe say we were misled by the management company." Another board member, a thin woman with a tight ponytail and a voice like sandpaper, chimed in. "Should we shred the amendment copy?" Gloria paused. "Not yet. If we destroy anything now, it's obstruction." She said it too late. My phone had already captured it. The next morning, I walked that recording into the sheriff's department. Detective Harris, a tall man with a slow drawl and a badge that had seen 2 decades of use, listened to the whole thing in silence. When it ended, he looked up with an expression I couldn't quite read. "You mind if I keep this? Be my guest," I said. He stood up, nodded once, and left the room. The door clicked shut behind him. The fallout began 2 days later. A notice went out to every homeowner in the neighborhood. The county had frozen all HOA enforcement actions pending a full investigation. All fines were suspended. All board meetings were to be documented and open to the public. And Gloria, she vanished for 72 hours. When she finally resurfaced, her front yard was filled with reporters. Local news vans lined the street, their crews swarming like ants. Someone, probably Greg, had tipped them off to the fraud probe. Footage of Gloria being asked about forged signatures aired that night alongside the words HOA under investigation. I didn't celebrate, not yet, because I knew people like Gloria didn't just fade away. They dug in, regrouped, and came back nastier. Sure enough, the next morning my mailbox was gone, not vandalized, removed, dug out from the ground like a weed. In its place, a laminated note stuck into the dirt with a garden stake. Non-compliant mailbox structure. Removed per emergency safety protocol. That's when I knew this wasn't just about the lake anymore. Gloria had made it personal, but she'd underestimated how many people she'd alienated and how many of them were finally ready to speak up. The morning after my mailbox was torn out, I got a visit from a leaner. She was the widow who lived 2 doors down, wore oversized sunglasses year-round, and kept to herself until now. She walked up my driveway holding a manila envelope like it was radioactive. "I've had this for years," she said, her voice steady but low. "Didn't think I'd ever use it, but after what they did to you, I think it's time." Inside the envelope were scanned copies of emails, handwritten notes, and a printed spreadsheet with names, dates, and dollar amounts. At the top of the list, Emergency Landscaping Fund Disbursement Schedule. I flipped through the pages in silence. They took money from our dues, Alina said. Used it to pay Ken's nephew for landscaping that never happened. Look at the addresses. They're all vacant lots. The spreadsheet included over 30 entries spanning 5 years. Every landscaping service invoice was tied to properties that had no structures, no owners, and no vegetation beyond wild grass and rocks. The amounts weren't small either. Some were over $2,000, all marked as approved by the board. "Why didn't you bring this forward sooner?" I asked. "I tried," she said. "Back in 2019. They threatened to put a lien on my house for non-compliance. I spent 6 months paying off fake fines just to keep them from dragging me into court." I stared at the documents. This wasn't just fraud, it was theft. Grand larceny if the totals were accurate. I took photos of everything, returned the originals to Alina, and promised her she wouldn't be standing alone this time. That afternoon, I met with Detective Harris again. This time, I brought a lawyer. His name was Marcus Lang, and he was the kind of attorney who didn't bother with business cards. Former federal prosecutor, now semi-retired and living 3 streets over. He'd heard about my situation from his niece, who worked at the courthouse. "You have them boxed in," Marcus said as he laid the documents across the table in the detective's office. "Fabricated invoices, misappropriation of funds. And this," he pointed to an internal board email referencing shifting surplus from the general fund to compensate for legal exposure, "is a smoking gun." Harris picked up the spreadsheet and nodded slowly. "If this checks out, we're no longer looking at just forged amendments. This is felony-level embezzlement," Marcus added, "and if they used USPs to send any of these bogus fine notices or invoices, we're talking federal charges too. Mail fraud." Within 24 hours, the sheriff's department secured a warrant to seize the HOA's financial records. The audit began the next morning. Gloria tried to stop it, of course. She stood at the clubhouse door in a wide-brimmed hat and oversized earrings, blocking the deputies with a clipboard in hand. "You can't just barge in here, this is private property," she shouted. The deputy leading the search team handed her a folded piece of paper. "Ma'am, this is a court-ordered warrant. Step aside." The clubhouse doors were opened. Boxes of files and 3 desktop computers were hauled out under police supervision. Ken stood in the parking lot with his arms crossed and jaw clenched, but he didn't say a word. Not this time. The community took notice. By the end of that week, neighbors who had never spoken up before started coming forward. A retired accountant down the street compiled a 10-page analysis of annual dues fluctuations and unaccounted expenditures. A young couple at the edge of the development produced video footage from their Ring doorbell showing Ken leaving violation notices on homes without even inspecting anything. And then there was Carl. Carl was a Vietnam vet who'd lived in the neighborhood since it was built. He walked with a cane and drove a battered pickup with a flag decal on the back window. He showed up at my door with a signed letter from when the HOA first formed a charter agreement that explicitly stated which parcels were excluded from the association's jurisdiction. "They tried to include my lot last year," Carl said. "Told me I had to start paying dues or they'd file a lien." "I sent him this," he tapped the letter. "Didn't hear another word." The letter confirmed what I already knew. The HOA had been trying to absorb properties outside its original reach for years. Illegally, quietly, and systematically. The district attorney's office got involved next. A grand jury was convened. Gloria, Ken, and 2 other board members were subpoenaed. Their attorney, a jittery man in an ill-fitting suit, tried to argue that the board had acted in good faith. The jury wasn't buying it. Then came the kicker. During the audit, an accountant discovered a separate bank account under the HOA's name, one that wasn't disclosed in any of the association's annual reports. It had been opened 5 years ago, and was used exclusively for consulting services. Nearly $80,000 had passed through it. The biggest recipient? A company called Kingsley Community Solutions LLC. Gloria's maiden name was Kingsley. The LLC was registered in her son's name. The fraud was no longer just a matter of sketchy bookkeeping. It was organized, deliberate, and profitable. Word spread fast. The neighborhood Facebook group exploded with posts, screenshots of documents, links to news articles, photos of Gloria being escorted out of the clubhouse by deputies. Some residents cheered. Others were just stunned. The county placed the HOA under temporary receivership while the legal process played out. A third-party administrator was appointed to oversee operations and ensure no further funds were misused. The board was formally dissolved. Gloria and Ken were arrested the following week. Charges included mail fraud, wire fraud, conspiracy to commit fraud, and embezzlement. Bail was denied. I didn't throw a party. Instead, I helped organize a community meeting in the park near the front entrance. We set up folding chairs, brought iced tea and cookies, and invited every homeowner to attend. Marcus stood beside me as we laid out a plan for reform. No more closed-door decisions. No more vague bylaws. No more power games. We draft a new charter, one based on transparency and consent. Every homeowner would have a vote and a voice. Leaner stood up near the end and addressed the crowd. I was afraid for a long time, she said. Afraid they'd ruin me if I spoke up, but we don't have to live like that, not anymore. The applause was quiet at first, then it spread. Even Carl nodded from his folding chair. A week later, the lake was calm again. I took the jet ski out just before dusk, not because I wanted to make a statement, but because the water was glassy and the air finally felt clean. As I cut across the surface, I saw the lights from the clubhouse now locked, empty, and stripped of its old banner. And I knew one thing: they'd tried to bury me with rules they didn't even have the right to write, but one line on a deed had been enough to crack the dam. And when it broke, the whole truth came flooding out. The new HOA administrator, a reserved man named Daniel Kwon, appointed by the county, called for a formal town hall in the high school auditorium 2 weeks after the arrests. It was the first time in the neighborhood's 40-year history that a meeting was held off-site away from the tainted clubhouse and Gloria's portrait still hanging in the hallway like a ghost of bad governance. Daniel opened with a clear agenda: outline the forensic audit's findings, confirm the legal status of the dissolved board, and present options for rebuilding the HOA if the residents wanted one at all. We're not here to force order on anyone, Daniel said, tapping his notes once and scanning the crowd. We're here to restore trust, if that's even possible. The overhead lights buzzed faintly as people shifted in their seats. Most had never attended an HOA meeting before. Some had lived here since the early '80s and only now realized how little oversight had ever existed. Daniel handed the floor to the forensic accountant hired by the county. A tall, sharp-featured woman named Naomi laid out the findings with brutal efficiency. Over $140,000 was funneled through undeclared bank accounts. 37% of that went to companies tied to family members of the former board. The remaining funds were siphoned into personal accounts through falsified vendor invoices. She paused as murmurs rippled through the room. Additionally, 32 properties were unlawfully classified under HOA jurisdiction through forged amendment filings. Those documents were submitted to the county with fraudulent vote tallies and falsified notary seals. A man in the second row leaned forward. "So how deep does this go? Were the notaries in on it?" Naomi answered without flinching. The notary stamps were stolen. One belonged to a woman who passed away in 2018. Her seal was used on 6 separate filings in 2022. The room went dead quiet. Daniel stepped back up. All fraudulent documents have been nullified by the county. The HOA charter has been suspended indefinitely. No dues will be collected until a lawful vote is held to re-establish governance if that's what the majority wants. An older woman near the aisle stood and clutched her purse like it was a shield. And what happens to the money that was taken? Daniel didn't sugarcoat it. The state attorney general's office has filed charges. If convictions are secured, restitution may be ordered. It won't be fast and it won't be full, but there will be consequences. I waited until the floor opened for public comment. I wasn't the first to speak, nor did I want to be, but when my turn came, I walked to the mic with the folder that had started it all, my original deed. I bought my home because the lake gave me peace, I said, but the last few months have shown me peace doesn't come from scenery. It comes from knowing you're not at the mercy of people who think rules are a crown. I held up the folder. This document was ignored, challenged, and nearly buried under a pile of fabricated laws. And if I hadn't read every line, none of us would have known what they were really doing. A few people nodded. Someone in the back clapped once, then stopped. I'm not asking for applause, I'm asking for awareness. If we build a new HOA, it needs to be built on transparency, not intimidation. And it needs to be voluntary, not a trap hidden in fine print. When the meeting ended, people didn't rush out. They lingered, talked, compared notes. A few even passed around old HOA newsletters, trying to piece together timelines and catch anything they'd missed before. Outside in the parking lot, I found Marcus leaning against his car, arms crossed loosely over a thick file folder. He looked more relaxed than he had in weeks. "You think they'll vote to restart it?" I asked. "Maybe," he said. "But if they do, it'll be with bylaws written in plain English and a recall clause that actually works." Gloria didn't leave one, she did. It required 90% approval and a notarized petition from every member. Impossible by design. He slid the folder into the back seat. That kind of thing won't happen again. 3 days later, the county prosecutor held a press conference. Gloria and Ken were being charged with 18 counts between them, including conspiracy, wire fraud, falsifying public records, and misuse of public funds. 2 other board members took plea deals in exchange for cooperation. But the real kicker came from an unexpected angle. The notary fraud triggered a federal investigation. When the Department of Justice got involved, they found evidence Gloria had used stolen identities to submit federal grant applications for neighborhood improvement projects that never existed. Over $25,000 in federal funds had been awarded. That crossed a line. Now she was facing federal wire fraud charges, and a separate investigation opened into every grant the HOA had ever applied for. By the end of the month, Gloria and Ken were transferred to federal custody. The neighborhood transformed slowly after that. The clubhouse was shuttered indefinitely, its locks changed by the county. A vote was held on whether to dissolve the HOA permanently. 78% voted yes. The remaining 22% were mostly folks who still believed in having a structured board, but even they agreed it needed a total reset. Without mandatory dues, people feared the community would fall apart. It didn't. In fact, it got better. Neighbors started organizing voluntary projects, cleanup days, landscaping groups. Even a new welcome committee made up of actual volunteers instead of power-hungry retirees. I helped install a community bulletin board near the mailboxes, and someone painted a mural on the old storage shed behind the tennis courts. The lake stayed mine, legally and peacefully. I added a floating dock and let the neighborhood kids fish off it on weekends. No one complained. No one called the cops. One morning, I found a folded note tucked into the latch of my new regulation-compliant mailbox. It was from a liener. "Funny how deep water can hide so many things," it read. "But eventually, everything floats to the surface." She was right. What started as a petty power play over a jet ski had unraveled a years-long scheme built on silence and forged paper. But the silence had cracked, and the paper trail had led straight to justice. By spring, The only thing breaking the calm was the sound of kids laughing by the water and the occasional hum of my jet ski engine heading out across the lake. No longer watched, no longer warned, and never again afraid.